of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to the extraordinary Joyce Vance for joining us tonight. I have been eagerly anticipating tonight's program, as is our audience, so we are so grateful. With so many critically important legal challenges cropping up each day, we look forward to our guest's analysis of the most important cases, likely outcomes, and just generally speaking, where Joyce Vance believes we're at the current time. Welcome and thanks as well to tonight's moderator, the beloved Patt Morrison. There's two programs this coming week starting Sunday. Sunday morning at 10 a.m., we're going to have our 22nd Israel and Crisis briefing. There's so much going on there that we haven't had an update for quite a few, maybe a couple of months. We will welcome Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz, Aluf Ben, in conversation with Patt Morrison. Please join us at 10 a.m. Pacific time on Sunday. And then next Wednesday, next week, we return to our usual day, Wednesdays. On February 26th, the week from tonight, we welcome constitutional law scholar and the Dean of UC Berkeley School of Law, Erwin Chemerinsky, in conversation with Larry Mantle. Two great programs over the next week, and with tonight, that's three. So many Americans are feeling overwhelmed and frustrated by the events emanating from Washington, which are coming at breakneck speed. There are those who respond to the stress by withdrawing from reading and listening to the news, and that is certainly understandable. It's a self-protective response, no doubt, but not so for our audience. We are so grateful to and proud of our America at a Crossroads audience for persisting, despite the fact that it can be exhausting and even painful. We all know that democracy is not a given and is certainly not guaranteed. And as tempting as it might be to surrender to frustration by avoiding what is happening, it's simply not an option. Staying engaged and informed is an essential component of preserving our democracy and is necessary to maintain hope for the future of our country. Please encourage your friends and family to watch our program and invite others to join as well. There are also many more activist nonprofit organizations which are worthy of your support and engagement. You can do your own searches on the web. There's tons of organizations doing really important work, many in the legal domain, but worthy of support. You can also look at the links on the activist pages on our Judge website for lots of ideas about where to get involved. Look at the bottom of tonight's email to register for all of our upcoming programs. Now, please welcome tonight's moderator, the brilliant Patt Morrison, columnist for the LA Times, winner of Golden Mike Awards, Emmys, and part of a Pulitzer for her reporting and broadcast journalism. Pat, thank you so much for being here and for always being here for America at a Crossroads. The program is yours.
It's always a pleasure and an honor to be here among people who are very smart and engaged, listening to people who are very smart and engaged, like our guest tonight, Joyce Vance. Well, as you all know, the election of last November really lined up like a slot machine, three branches of government, the judiciary, already with the Supreme Court being a majority appointment by Republicans, the Congress, both branches of Congress being taken by elections by Republicans, and of course the White House by Donald Trump. What we didn't factor on was the role, the presence, and the influence of Elon Musk. Beyond just writing checks for campaign support, he now takes a chief role in government. And so we're asking a number of questions tonight, not just about that, but about the nature of the Constitution and the strength of the institutions that are created by the Constitution and whether or not they can hold under these circumstances. We have a kind of constitutional triage that we'll be putting to Joyce Vance, a question of which issues matter most, which questions get to go to the courts most, which should we be focused on, what should alarm us, and what can we maybe dial down to 9 instead of 11 a little bit. So Joyce Vance, walking us through this unprecedented, a popular word in the last 10 years, this unprecedented state of affairs. We're very grateful to you for doing it. Thank you.
Well, listen, I'm awfully glad to get to be with y'all. A very wise man once said that you should never be morose alone. And so I'm glad that we're all together to look at these events. Pat, I'm honored to have the chance to try to answer your questions as best as I can. I think it's an important moment for all of us as Americans to spend time together in community and to reflect on why it matters so much to live in a democracy, why it's worth preserving that democracy. We are definitely going to face some challenges ahead. I think challenges that none of us anticipated facing in our lifetime. And we will be called upon to answer that challenge that Ben Franklin issued as he walked out of the Constitutional Convention, and a woman in the crowd sort of yelled out at him, "Dr. Franklin, what have you given us? Is it a monarchy or what is it?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." And that's the challenge. We now have to try to keep it.
I use the phrase constitutional triage because everything feels like it's being rushed into the emergency room. Right now, today, we had Judge Chutkan, the Federal District Court in Washington, saying to the attorneys general of 14 states who had really tried to stop Elon Musk from doing what he's been doing, getting access to data at federal agencies, firing people across the board in the federal government. And her declining to consider this wasn't saying that your case has no merit, it's that you don't have the standing to take this on. We've also heard that members of Congress don't have the standing. This is maybe one of the most critical matters, is what Elon Musk does and in what capacity. So where do matters stand right now, and what are the options, and who has them? Maybe you and I can go to court.
Well, here's one where I'll dial down our anxiety level a little bit. First off, if you're having trouble keeping up with all of the lawsuits that have been filed, I think now we are close to, if not over 50 lawsuits challenging executive branch actions taken by Trump or on his behalf since the inauguration. If you cannot keep up, I have a tip for you. Write this down: Just Security Litigation Tracker. My wonderful colleague, Ryan Goodman at New York University Law School, who leads the Just Security Institute there, has created a litigation tracker. You can go to that, and if there's a case that you don't understand, that you want to know, what's this case about? Who's the judge? Where's it happening? You can just search for the keywords and find that case, because there's literally so much going on all fronts that some days I feel like my head is going to explode. Today, this case in front of Judge Chutkan has been the big news. This is one of the cases challenging DOJ. And the important thing to remember, I bet that there are a lot of lawyers in the House tonight, these cases are at a very, very early preliminary stage. And what's happening right now is that we have plaintiffs who are challenging DOJ, and they are going into court and saying, "Judge, I need a temporary restraining order." That's an early sort of a legal device that freezes the status quo in place, that keeps DOJ from acting. You've seen some of these other cases at Treasury where a judge entered a TRO and told DOJ, "You got to get out of Treasury systems, you got to destroy anything that you had already taken." This is just a very temporary move that freezes the status quo so the parties can brief the issues for the judges. We're talking about 7 days, 2 weeks, before everyone can get into court and start litigating the case. So the fact that Judge Chutkan did not give this TRO, said that there was no standing at this point, I don't read too much into. It's easy to get plaintiffs with standing. The situation changes as this progresses. And she intimated in some of the written order that she issued that she believed that there were viable charges in this case. So at least here we can feel good. Many judges are issuing temporary restraining orders, 3 or 4 cases where the judges said, "I just don't see irreparable injury yet," which is what the plaintiffs have to prove to get the TRO. So we're not there yet, but we're getting there, unfortunately.
When Joyce Vance was a federal prosecutor and the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, one of her areas of specialty was public corruption. So that's why she's very much au fait with what it is we are talking about. You also see her regularly on MSNBC. And if you want to know more after our program, you can always listen to her Sisters-in-Law podcast with Jill Wine-Banks, Barbara McQuaid, and some other really, really smart gals. So that's a way to continue the conversation beyond this conversation. You talk about the TROs and no irreparable harm, but things are moving very fast with DOJ, with Musk, with Trump. And the idea that a 19-year-old with a memory stick in his hoodie that has all the information about everybody's Social Security, for example, you really wonder how much of this can be walked back. But the larger question everybody's asking is, who is Musk to be doing this? He's not in charge of Doge, but he's in charge of Doge. What is Doge's official status? He's a senior advisor. Does he have any oath of office that he had to take? He just seems to be floating above all of this with the blessing of Donald Trump.
Yeah. So look, this is really disturbing. Musk is obviously not elected because they claim non-governmental status or quasi-governmental status, whatever it is that they're saying today, because it changes from day to day. The claim is that he's a White House advisor, not somebody who has to be vetted. And the whole point of having a system of government employees is that those employees are responsible to the people of the United States. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the law. They have to pass background checks. They have to engage in public disclosures of their financial status, of transactions, of conflicts of interest. None of that is happening with Musk. And so at this very fundamental level, you don't have to do a deep dive into the legal issues that are being raised in this case to see that something here is not right, that this is someone who is functioning like a government employee, but with none of the restrictions and the accountability that should be in place for a public servant. And that, of course, makes you say, well, why? If Musk really wants to work on fraud and waste, why not take a government job? Why not hold him to the same accountability standards as other employees? And that, I think, is the troubling insight here, the fact that there is no willingness to subject Musk to the rule of law any more than Donald Trump is willing to subject himself to the rule of law.
So when the attorneys general were turned aside by Judge Chutkan today for want of standing, because from where they stand, from what they do, no harm has been done yet. Where is the constitutional opening to say to the federal courts, here's Elon Musk. He's not a sworn officer. He's not an elected official. How does this constitutional question and his power even get addressed in the courts?
Yeah, so this is a really great and a super important question, Pat, right? For every case, you have to find someone with standing. In essence, that means you've got to have a connection to the harms that are occurring in the case. You've got to, as a legal doctrine, have an issue that you can take in front of the court where the court can rule on the issues that you're interested in and come up with a remedy that will solve your problems. I can't just walk into court tomorrow and say, listen, I really object to the fact that the sky is blue. Because I don't have sufficient standing to raise in that ridiculous hypothetical any sorts of viable legal claims. So
but if you were colorblind.
There you go, right? But so we're seeing this sort of standing assessment. This hasn't really been a problem. In most of the cases that are going forward, standing has not been an issue. I think that there are two where that has been raised so far. What lawyers do when a judge tells them that their plaintiffs don't have standing is they just go out and they find clients who do have standing and they come back. But this is a great place, I think, for all of us to give a nod to the service that's being performed by the state attorneys general across the country. These people are absolutely formidable. They have come together in a way that we have not seen. I mean, typically, the Democratic attorneys general are a group, and the same for the Republicans. Here, the Democratic attorneys general, first off the mark, challenging birthright citizenship. That early ruling out of a federal court up in Seattle happened because 4 of the attorneys general filed that lawsuit challenging Donald Trump's ability to rewrite the Constitution with just the stroke of a pen. We're seeing that now in the Doge cases and in other cases. And I would note that the attorneys general have been very conservative, not politically conservative, but legally conservative in the approaches that they are taking. They are finding mainstream legal theories. They are being diligent. They are being judicious with the way that they are bringing their cases. These aren't crazy guys flinging bodies off the cliffs. These are very, very smart women, men and women who are bringing really well-sustained legal theories. I think we're going to see these cases have a lot of success in court.
If you'd like to put your questions to Joyce Vance, we'll be getting to them later in the hour, and you can go to the Q&A and put them in there with your name and where you're from. We'd like to share that as well as your question when we get around to it. You had written on your Substack earlier that the courts are not the cavalry. Just because it doesn't feel like in the middle of a constitutional crisis, Trump isn't dramatically crossing out broad swaths of the Constitution with his Sharpie. in a made-for-TV moment doesn't mean we aren't there. So what is it that the courts can do and what is beyond their reach?
Yeah, so let me share the context in which that piece was written. I write a newsletter on Substack called Civil Discourse. Bless my heart, I write it just about every night. I didn't mean to do that when I started out, but we live in interesting times. And so I think it's important for us, and by trade, I'm a law professor at the University of Alabama. I teach and study in the field of democratic institutions. And so I spend a lot of time thinking, what are the roles of the different institutions? What can we ask the institutions to do? What makes them strong? What makes them weak? What do we do as members of the community to support the institutions? And so the point that I make in this piece is really a very simple one. It's that the courts are courts of limited scope. There are legal claims that they can address. Right now, we are seeing district judges, trial judges do a very important job of preserving the status quo, issuing these temporary restraining orders or TROs so that the issues can be litigated. How that looks when we get to the Supreme Court, that's anyone's guess. The first case to get to the Supreme Court is there right now. It is a case involving Donald Trump firing the special counsel of the United States. I've probably just confused you. This is not a special counsel in the sense that Jack Smith was a special counsel. This is actually an office that oversees, among other things, whistleblowers. And it's an office that does a tremendous amount of work to try to deal with government fraud, waste, and abuse. So, special counsel of the United States, Donald Trump doesn't like this guy, so he fires him. I thought that he wanted to get rid of waste and abuse, but apparently not enough to keep this guy around who had just immaculate credentials. And so this individual, Hampton Dellinger, has challenged whether or not he can be fired. And that case has actually been appealed by the Justice Department to the Supreme Court. So we will get an early look at how the Supreme Court's going to handle these cases. Now look, I am trying to be cautiously optimistic these days. I don't think it does any of us any service to be ridiculously optimistic. The Supreme Court that, in my view, wrongly gave Donald Trump virtually full immunity from criminal prosecution because of presidential immunity. That's one view on that court. And then there's this issue of presidential power. And I think we need to steel ourselves and understand that this is a court where there may well be 5 votes that say that the president should have more power than the presidency has traditionally had. This may be a court that's going to do something to weaken the independent agencies that we have become very used to seeing in public life. The Justice Department maintains a certain amount of independence from the White House, not on issues of policy or issues of priority setting, but when it comes to the individual cases that it prosecutes, who gets indicted, who doesn't, the White House doesn't get to play in that. Donald Trump thinks he does, and we are going to see those issues get litigated in the courts in the course of this presidency. So look, I think that the courts, we hope that they will hold, they will do a lot of work. Ultimately, the point of my piece was that it's up to us. It's up to the people to preserve democracy, and we shouldn't count too much on the courts, Congress, the executive branch, the media, or anyone else to do the work that is now incumbent for us to do.
I want to get in a minute to some of the specifics, like today, the head of the criminal division in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington resigning, about the resignations in New York over the Eric Adams case. But what you just said raises the question, which has been rooted about, let's say, by J.D. Vance in public, by Elon Musk in public. Well, what if we don't do what the courts tell us to do? We think we have a constitutional crisis now. We remember Richard Nixon obeyed the courts in turning over the Watergate tapes. But what happens if an entire executive branch refuses to do what it is constitutionally obliged to do, which is follow the guidance of and decisions of the judiciary?
Right. So if that happens, we will be in a full-blown constitutional crisis. Even Richard Nixon, when the Supreme Court ordered him to turn over the White House tapes to the special prosecutor, he did that. He followed the court's order. If we reach the point where Donald Trump doesn't do that, we are in deep trouble. And J.D. Vance, who I always feel obligated to say, no kin, we have the same last name, but we are not related in any way, shape, or form that I'm aware of. J.D. Vance is a Yale-educated lawyer. And for him to suggest that the executive branch doesn't have to follow the dictates of the courts is just shockingly irresponsible, and I think a real measure of the man. Fortunately, this is one area, and it's really one of the only examples of this that I can think of recently, where cooler heads seem to have prevailed. And a number of Republican senators made statements talking about the importance of the executive branch following the dictates of the courts. And after they made those comments, we saw the White House, instead of going, the J.D. Vance road and flouting court orders, we saw them instead file appeals. That's how this one case is already going to the Supreme Court. That, I think, is a really early and important marker of our path forward. And this same thing that I was writing about the other night in my newsletter, there was a lot of public outrage when J.D. Vance made those comments and Elon Musk made those comments about just ignoring courts, essentially saying we don't care about the courts. So much public outrage that it bled over into Republican senators who felt obligated to make statements. And then the White House got into line and filed appeals using the courts instead of ignoring them. I think that tells us something important. Donald Trump will push as far as he believes he can get away with. But when he understands that he's in trouble, that he's risking the end of his, sort of the cult of personality that lets him do a lot of the crazy things that he does, he will back off. And he clearly backed off here, at least for now. Our job is to keep that pressure up.
So let's talk then about some of those individual cases we mentioned. The head of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., Denise Chung, who had written in her resignation letter that she and the FBI were ready to ask a bank to freeze the assets of a multi-billion-dollar Biden environmental grant initiative, but she balked when the interim U.S. Attorney Edward Martin told her to open what she called an unfounded investigation sought by Emil Bowe, the acting deputy attorney general, into this same program, that she would go this far, but no further. So what is that a kind of, you were in this position as a U.S. attorney. What are the rules and the standards, and why would one go so far but no farther? And another question about resignations, like Jack Smith's, why not stay on and fight versus clearing the field, as some people have considered it to be?
Yeah, a lot tied up in there. Let me try to hit some of the high notes.
Sorry for the complexities there.
No, I mean, these are, and it's important for us to understand that these are by nature complicated issues. You can't understand this stuff in a tweet or on a bumper sticker. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to oversimplify. And so I would really encourage you, however you get your news, to make sure you're looking at a lot of different sources. Personally, I really like Substack. I not only write there, I read there. I'm a news consumer on Substack, and I see that you have my colleague Jen Rubin in a few weeks, who is the editor of The Contrarian, which is another Substack publication. But do go ahead and inform yourself and read up on these issues. Look, here's what happened in DC today with the resignation of the criminal chief. She was directed to open a criminal investigation. You have to have probable cause to believe a crime has been committed before you can do that. Probable cause is a pretty low standard. It means something like, there's credible evidence that suggests a crime might have been committed, so we need to look further. I mean, this is not a high burden like proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial. The fact that she thought that that modest quantum of proof did not exist and refused to open a case really tells you something about what Emil Bowe, who is the acting deputy attorney general, and Ed Martin, the interim U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia, what sorts of cases they're cooking up. This is what we've all been afraid of: revenge prosecutions that are intended to punish enemies, or by the same token, as we saw in New York this week, dismissing cases in an effort to help friends, or at least to help out people who you can get a political quid pro quo from. So we are in a really dangerous point when we see this sort of conduct happening. Excuse me, I'm down in the basement and there's dust or something that's making me cough. But your question, Pat, about why not just stick it out is a really intriguing one. You know, I was a federal prosecutor for 25 years. I was career for a long time. I was in the criminal division. I ran our appellate division. And then I got appointed by President Obama to be the U.S. attorney in Birmingham, where I served for 8 years. As a line prosecutor, I always had the freedom, and I knew I had the freedom, not something that you do every day of the week. Some people don't do it in their whole careers. But if I was asked to work on a case that I had concerns about, I had the ability to say, I don't want to work on this case. I'll work on other stuff. Or I don't want to sign this motion. And I did come to a point midway through my career where I was working with the U.S. attorney on a case. She wanted me to file a motion. I thought it was the wrong thing to do for reasons I won't go into. And I told her so. And I told her I wouldn't be able to sign the motion. I went home to dinner and told my husband, you know, I'm probably going to get fired in the morning. And I walked in, and to her credit, she said she had thought about it. And she had decided that we wouldn't file the motion. She could have had somebody other than me file. I could have gone to work on another case. All sorts of options. And that's good, right? As a U.S. attorney, I wanted my prosecutors to be able to tell me earnestly what they thought was the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do in these cases. We give prosecutors this awesome power, the power over people's lives and their freedom. You know, at the end of a civil case, everybody's going home. At the end of a criminal case, there's the possibility that someone will be locked up for a significant period of time, taken away from their family. We want our prosecutors to be just vigilant about making sure that they're getting it right. But not so much these days. On her first day in office, Pam Bondi, the new Attorney General, issued a number of orders inside of DOJ. One of them is an order that tells prosecutors that they no longer have that right of conscience, that they can no longer decline to file a motion or work on a case, and that if they do so, they'll be fired. Hence, we saw the criminal chief resign before that could happen.
And the other incident of some, when the Trump administration wanted the charges against Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, to be dropped, and the U.S. Attorney Danielle Sassoon, who had clerked for Justice Scalia, and a member of the Federalist Society, so not a liberal, she resigned, and rather than go along with this, because there were no grounds for saying, well, you know, the evidence was bad, or, you know, this was wrongful prosecution. It was just to be done as a political move. And then a man whose name nobody knew before outside of those circles, Hagen Scotton, as the assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, also resigned. And his letter, if I can quote a little bit of it, was an absolute masterpiece of rebuke. And he too had clerked for Justice Roberts on the Supreme Court. And to make it in brief, any assistant U.S. attorney would know that our laws and traditions do not allow using the prosecutorial power to influence other citizens, much less, why don't you take a drink of water while I'm reading this?
I'm so sorry, y'all.
Oh, no, that's all right. I'm going to be doing a little bit of talking for a moment here. Do not allow using the prosecutorial power to influence other citizens, much less elected officials, in this way. If no lawyer within earshot of the president is willing to give him that advice, then I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me. I think people were standing up literally and figuratively cheering this across the country as they saw how this man, who is conservative in his own principles, stood up to an abuse, as he put it, of the law and of the process.
I mean, he essentially says at the top of that letter that he's a Trump supporter, that he agrees with Donald Trump on policy issues. And yet he comes to this one matter of principle where he has to resign his job because he can't go along with what they're being asked to do. And let's make sure that we all understand what happened here, right? The mayor of New York gets indicted, charged essentially with bribery, including taking bribes from a foreign power, from Turkish interests. It is a good case. Is it a case that the government can get a conviction in? I don't know, because it hasn't gone to trial yet. Probably it won't go to trial. But it was a case that passed muster. Indicted by a grand jury, proceeding seriously, and out of the blue, you get a new administration, and the acting deputy attorney general directs the U.S. attorney in Manhattan in the Southern District of New York to go ahead and dismiss the case. And this is what Danielle Sassoon does, and she is a real hero in this story. She's an acting U.S. attorney, which means she's not the real deal. She was career in the office, working in the office. They put her in place until the Trump appointee can be confirmed. She is, by the way, I'm told by friends in the Southern District, very good friends with Emil Beauvais. That's how she got the job of being the acting in the first place, because they were friends. She writes him an 8-page letter expressing her concerns about dismissing the case, and she asks for a meeting with the Attorney General of the United States. Now, look, that's a normal thing for a U.S. attorney to do. If you're being asked to do something that you don't think is the right outcome in a big, important case, which this one is, you ask to meet with the Attorney General and talk it out. And what's so shocking here is that instead of granting that request, her friend Emil Beauvais accepts her resignation. And one of the things, by the way, in Hagan's letter that I think really lets you know how principled these people are is that he makes a point of saying that he never had to refuse the order to file a motion to dismiss the case because Danielle, his U.S. attorney, never asked him to do it. In other words, she wasn't willing to put it off on the people who worked for her. She wanted to take responsibility. She saw the problem. In the Justice Department, we don't dismiss cases that are well based on the facts and the law so that someone can get political advantage out of the case. And it sets an absolutely horrible, horrible possible trajectory for this Justice Department. Perhaps we will now see that people who have something to offer the president will be able to get out of jail free, right? They'll be able to say, well, I'll just line up and help you with your immigration policy, which is what there's correspondence, by the way, from the mayor of New York's lawyers to the Justice Department saying, I support your immigration policy. I'd like to help, but I can't while I'm under indictment. That's how this case gets dismissed. And it's a real problem if we're going to see more and more of this. That is not justice.
One of the great puzzlements is how the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate of the United States, a duly constituted, independent, equal branch of government, has kind of folded when it comes to asserting or pushing back on the Trump administration kind of taking over its roles, saying that it intends to dissolve the functions, if not the actual shell of agencies that have been created by Congress. And is there any constitutional recourse there? Can just John or Jane Q. Citizen go to a court and say, hey, I want you to tell Congress to do its job? This is so outside the mainstream of any constitutional precedent, I think, that we don't know what to do about it.
Well, this goes back to our earlier conversation about standing. And there are people outside of Congress who have standing, and we're seeing those lawsuits, and so far they're succeeding. Look, Congress has the power of the purse. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, one of the most foundational powers that's assigned to Congress is they get to decide who to allocate money to, what the budget looks like, what gets spent, what doesn't, all of this stuff, power of the purse stuff. When presidents try to prevent Congress's directions from being enforced, that's called impoundment. And so we're seeing a number of lawsuits challenging impoundment. We saw this with some of the USAID, the dissolution of that agency that happened earlier, but there are other sorts of lawsuits. And there are people with standing. They're both employees of the agencies and recipients of the aid or of the spending. So I think that we will see a strong line of cases in this regard. This is an interesting one. It's tough to know how the Supreme Court will receive these cases. There is, as this court likes to say, a history and a tradition of letting Congress decide how the money gets spent, not the presidency. There is strong precedent from the Supreme Court itself on this issue. So we'll find out if they're willing to make new rules for Donald Trump or not.
Well, do you have any tea leaf readings on this court? You have John Roberts, who people think is the one who wants to preserve the court's legacy and its standing. You've got Amy Coney Barrett, who has parted company on a couple of recent big decisions. maybe some surprises in there, or maybe going along with the Trump agenda beyond what even standard legal decisions and precedent would suggest.
Well, I think it would be shocking if the textualist conservatives on the Supreme Court could not read the clear dictates in Article 1 of the Constitution that give Congress the power of the person and not the president. Look, I mean, I quit trying to read the tea leaves on this court really after they reversed Roe versus Wade. And certainly by the point where they decided that presidents could commit crimes and not be held accountable for them as long as they were official acts, or at least colorably official acts, I just sort of tore up my notes. We, I think, need the Supreme Court to do its job. We need the Supreme Court to enforce constitutional limits on the power of the presidency to avoid tipping the scales towards autocracy. But this term, really the next 2 or 3 terms will tell the story. I think it's tough to game it out in advance.
During the Jim Crow era, when we heard states' rights, it meant states limiting the rights of people, Black people, their rights of movement, their rights of access. And now we think of states' rights as states expanding access to things like abortion rights, reproductive rights, the rights of LGBTQ people. How large is this going to be a player in the next 3 years, 11 months of the Trump administration and some of the cases and precedents that it's trying to bring, in some cases through red states, to enact its policies?
Yeah, I mean, so here's a really interesting aspect of this issue. In Dobbs, when the Supreme Court took away the federal guarantee of abortion rights to women, it said, we are leaving it up to the states. That's sort of the classic states' rights argument. Every state can do its own thing. Now we're seeing a move, and Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has suggested she might be a part of this, to sort of nationalize the opposition to abortion. There's an old law called the Comstock Act that prohibits mailing anything that's used to perform an abortion or any information about abortion and other scandalous material. Like under the Comstock Act, women can't mail material about family planning. That would all become a federal crime. If Pam Bondi decides to go back to enforcing the Comstock Act, which has been sort of left by the wayside for the last 100 years, that would mean a national ban on abortion. And yet we have a Supreme Court that has told us, oh no, this is state by state. Same deal with medication abortion. The overwhelming majority of abortions performed in this country use medication like mifepristone and mifepristol. And instead of letting every state decide what to do, there's now a move on to let states that want to ban medicated abortion also try to ban it in an extraterritorial way. So Louisiana has now indicted a New York doctor who mails medication to women in Louisiana. And we will see these cases go up to the court, and we will learn, I think, to your point, Pat, just what states' rights mean in this day and age.
And perhaps that doctor can never travel to Texas, but if the powers that be determine that this is, as you say, a nationwide thing, that doctor may be in great jeopardy even in the state of New York.
Well, so far, and I can't remember if it was Governor Hochul who said this or another state official, but they in essence said, we're not going to turn over a citizen of the state of New York to Louisiana for prosecution. And in fact, New York is one of a handful of states that had passed a law that specifically said that they would not turn over their citizens for prosecution in this sort of situation. But that sets up the conflict that sooner or later, if not this term, 2-3 years down the road, we'll head to the United States Supreme Court for a decision.
We're going to take some of your questions about this for Joyce Vance. And this may be, you talk about not going too much into politics. So if this is beyond your scope, please say so. That Marla wanted to know about Eric Adams, if he is no longer mayor, if he is removed, for example, or loses the election. The charges were dismissed without prejudice. Can he be charged again once he loses his usefulness?
Yeah, so it's really an interesting question, right? It's sort of like the Trump administration has put a choke collar on Mayor Adams because instead of dismissing the charges and saying that they're completely gone, which is what they'll ask of a federal judge in Manhattan for permission to do tomorrow afternoon, they can't do it without leave of court. But even if the judge gives them permission to dismiss, they don't want permission to do it with finality. They want to do it with permission to bring those charges again down the road if Adams doesn't perform as they do. And if the judge, in fact, grants that motion in the way that they have framed it, they absolutely could. If you're Eric Adams, you better hope that you're very useful to Donald Trump because he still has that leash with the collar on it around your neck for the rest of the period before the statute of limitations would run on prosecuting this case.
Judith wants to know about Trump's executive order essentially giving him and him alone and the Attorney General the power to determine what the law is. We've seen this in dictatorships before. Is this going to get swatted right out of court, or is this something that the courts will take seriously?
So, bear with me on this. I am pretty sure that in our system of government, it's the courts that say what the law is and what the law means, and the courts that have the final word, including the Supreme Court. And so I imagine that this might be one area where we will see the courts stand up for themselves against Donald Trump. Because you're right, this is sort of a crazy sort of talk, and this is another permutation of the president doesn't have to follow the law sort of argument that we see being posted in a lot of different ways right now.
There's also concern in some quarters that the demonstrations that we're seeing on the streets, people turning out to oppose Trump policies, as happened in his first term, that this will be used as a rationale by the Trump administration to deploy even federal troops in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act out into the streets to say, well, this is a rebellion, this is very dangerous. Even people who are there with babies in strollers and drinking cups of coffee and not carrying anything in the way of weapons, that this would be imputed as a danger to the government, as an insurrection. And it sounds far-fetched, but so much of what we've been talking about would have sounded far-fetched a half dozen years ago.
Yeah, we should not discount things simply because they sound far-fetched. And I think this is a perplexing issue. As Americans, we have a First Amendment right to peacefully assemble, to petition the government, to express our views. We absolutely have a right to protest. And I think it's really important, frankly, that we exercise our democracy muscles right now. We need to regain, I remember during the first Trump term, knitting my pink pussy hat and being out on the streets with my daughter and all of our neighbors protesting from day one. That has not happened in that sustained fashion this go round. Some of it, I think, is this concern people have that Donald Trump might deploy the military in the United States. And as you mentioned, Pat, presidents can't use the military for domestic law enforcement because of something called the Posse Comitatus Act. But like everything in the law, there are some exceptions. And so Trump could, there's a theory that he could invoke the Insurrection Act and use that to deploy the military on American streets. He can only do that if there are these sort of violent, out of control protests and everything's crazy. And of course, I have heard people say a number of things. The fact that he could mischaracterize protests, the fact that in many protests, there might be one person who does something that's either misconstrued or maybe somebody does do something violent and that one act gets blown out of sorts, or even that you could have false flag sort of activity that would be used to trigger the insurrection attack. I think that there is a lot of anxiety around protests for this reason. But this is not a straight line path forward for Donald Trump. I mean, you're talking about deploying American troops on American soil against American civilians. And I have never been fully convinced that he wants to go there. Not that we might not get there during this administration. Look, I mean, I think that that's a possibility we can't discount. I think a problem that we sometimes have, though, is we have this vision of Donald Trump as being all powerful and of his autocracy as being inevitable because he gets away with so much. And again, I think that this is an area where we need to be vigilant. We need to demand that our rights be protected. You know, if there were protests that he tried to shut down, if the Insurrection Act were invoked, there would be a lot of people in court very quickly. And again, that would be a moment where we would have to rely on the courts to protect our rights.
I think early in the 2020 campaign, there were public service spots that were put on the air about a woman and her mother being stopped by law enforcement out driving a car, and they were going to another state to get an abortion, and they were both arrested or taken into custody because of this, which seemed, again, far-fetched. But Ruth's question now is about the federal crime for the government checking women's email, checking to see whether they got medication about abortion, even if they were discussing it, monitoring menstrual cycles. The privacy presumption was pretty much gutted after Roe v. Wade was thrown out, I would think, especially on this matter. And even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said it was a wobbler. It was not maybe a strong foundation. But would any imputed right to privacy protect women under circumstances like this?
Well, I think what you're talking about, you know, this was this ad. It was a fictitious ad. It wasn't something that it had actually happened. It actually, I think, was set in Alabama. And the premise was that state prosecutors, states attorneys generals in states like Alabama would prosecute women who tried to travel out of the state of Alabama to a state where abortion was legal in order to access care. That is a very realistic possibility. And that leads to the question of what sort of investigative devices could prosecutors and police use to investigate women for those crimes. I think now we're talking about state prosecutions for the most part, because these are state laws. And yes, I think realistically, in the right circumstances, they could seek subpoenas or other court orders to access people's emails, text messages, other communications, just like you can do in a drug trafficking case or a bank robbery or any other sort of lawsuit where you can access people's communications. If there was a state law that said that it was a crime to leave the state to get an abortion, and if you as the state attorney general or as a district attorney wanted to investigate that, you could seek evidence just like you could in any other case.
Because it had been a priori criminalized to do that in your state.
Yeah, I mean, police are entitled to investigate crimes.
We've spoken about freedom of movement and about some of the passport regulations that the Trump administration is putting in place that very much affect women and transgender people.
Yeah, so there are two different threads here. First is this notion that you can no longer get a passport that accurately reflects who you are if you're transgender. There's litigation underway about these cases. I note that in one of the cases about the military, today in court, a judge expressed utter incredulity at the government's position that permitting people to identify themselves as non-binary or as not male or female, or to insist on using the gender of their choice, that somehow impacted military readiness. The judge gave a strong signal that he was on the side of the plaintiffs in that case. You know, what's happening in those cases, I think, is so appalling. It's this effort to single out transgender people and to say to, at least to Trump's base and maybe to the rest of the country, you know, these people aren't like you. They're not as good as you, so we can treat them differently. And this process of othering people and making it okay to take away their fundamental rights is really dangerous. Even if you don't feel strongly in your heart that you want to protect transgender people, and I bet all of us on this call do have that feeling, you know, you should think about where that leads, right? I mean, it's the classic German statement. First, they came for the trade unions, but I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't care. And then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew. And by the time they came to the churchmen, there was no one left to protect people like me. This is what we are seeing in practice here. We need to all come to the defense of the transgender community and stand as allies to them, because what is happening is, I just think, unconscionable. A separate issue on passports if it's okay, because I think it's important for people to know. The Republicans in the House have introduced something called the SAVE Act. This is an act that will require you to have identification to vote. It'll be a national requirement, and it hits really hard on older people and poor people who may not have identification. It also weirdly has the potential to hit married women. Who, if your birth certificate is in your maiden name, and if you now are using your married name, but it's not a legal name change and you don't have documentation that adds up to your legal change, you're going to find that you have some difficulty voting. So educate yourself about the SAVE Act. If you consider it the way that I do, you may want to write to your representatives and ask them to reject it. It's really bad for women, among other people.
Pam wants to know what you have to say about the administration's firing of the immigration judge, Carrie Doyle, in Massachusetts. And, we've heard Elon Musk, and immigration judges are different in my understanding from regular federal, like district court judges, but immigration judges have been understaffed for many years. So immigration cases have been held up in many ways, including this. But we also had Elon Musk saying essentially we should look at all federal judges, and if they're underperforming, we should fire them. These are lifetime appointments, and these are two different matters. So perhaps you can address them singly, and the impact of them.
Yeah, so the immigration judges are administrative law judges. They do not have life tenure. They work from inside of the Justice Department. They have really heavy dockets. I can recall a point in time during the Bush administration where everything was stretched so thin, the Justice Department didn't have enough prosecutors, that they shipped cases out to every U.S. attorney's office in the field. All 94 of the U.S. attorney's offices were handling cases that were ending up in federal courts. These were, for the most part, cases that had gone through the administrative judge stage and were into court. But it's a mess because we don't resource immigration. And that's just frankly quite true. That's why that system is in so many ways broken. We don't put the resources into it, and we still expect to get results. So I think these firings, and I'm not familiar with that particular one, but they reflect, I think, this same notion of Trump wanting to have people who are loyal to him, not wanting to have people who he perceives as being pro-immigration in these sorts of jobs. And that's an issue that they'll have to work out. As for Elon Musk suggesting, and I don't know how many of you saw this tweet, I woke up early one morning and saw it, and it's just sort of crazy. He just suggested that, well, maybe we should have an elected body, presumably that's the Republican-led Congress, vote once a year, and the 1% of judges who are the worst get voted off the island. And that's just not how our system works. We give federal judges life tenure for a reason. That is so they can set aside their affiliation. Everybody gets to be a federal judge because a president from one party or the other appoints them. The notion is that you have life tenure so that once you have the job, you can set that aside and make your rulings on the basis of the facts and the law. By and large, there are some notable exceptions. By and large, federal judges do a damn good job at that.
Before we wrap with a point of optimism and hope, I do want to ask you, what have you learned in recent months about, sorry, my Greek chorus back there, my furry Greek chorus. What have you learned about how Americans don't understand how their government works?
Well, I'll tell you, I sort of think that the silver lining of the first Trump administration was that people actually got really engaged with government in ways that we had not seen for a long time. And to me, a big problem that we have is a failure of civics education in our communities. I'm old enough that I had pretty good civics education in elementary school. Kids these days, I talk a lot with my law students about this, they're not getting the same kinds of civics education, or maybe they got enough in fourth grade that they sort of caught fire in that moment, but they didn't get the more sophisticated sort of education that they need. And so unless they go on to college and law school, they may really not understand, for instance, how the three branches of government work, and the fact that the founding fathers set up Congress and the courts to be a check on the president because they feared a president who would become too powerful and tyrannical. exactly what we're seeing in this moment. You know, this is stuff that the founding fathers actually wrote about in the Federalist Papers. But we see too many people in our communities who don't know and who are vulnerable to people who spread misinformation. That's why I just, you know, really every time I see the vice president who knows better saying things about our form of government that are not true, it makes me want to double down on the effort to reinstate civics education in our country. That's something that we're going to have to do to get through this.
We need a civics vaccine.
Yeah, we do.
We do have a couple of minutes, and we like to spend those with some hopeful notes, some optimistic notes, some points of guidance to so many of our listeners saying, what can I do as an individual?
I think that that's the biggest question, right? That we're all struggling with these days. I mean, what can I do against the richest man in the world? Here's the answer that I'm working on for myself. I think it's important to stay really well informed about what's going on at the national level. And it's important to get involved at the local level, because the local level of government is the one that's closest to us. It's the one where we can have the most impact. That might mean going to city council meetings. It might mean volunteering to work in the polls for the midterm elections. It might mean I have a group of friends and neighbors down here. We are persistently trying to get communication going with our senators who really don't want to communicate with us, even though they're our employees. I live in Alabama. We have 2 Republican senators. They have not really been very open to the idea of having an exchange of information with their constituents. And I think that we're entitled to that. So that's something that, in my view, is worth pursuing. I understand and I'm sympathetic to the people who say that what's going on in Washington is too much and they just have to shut it out for their own, you know, personal health. I think, frankly, it is a lot easier to look at what's going on right now and try to come to grips with it and fix it while it's still possible for us to do that than it would be to live under Trump's vision of what he wants to turn into America into. We got to stay informed. We got to have these tough conversations with our friends and neighbors. I mean, we are looking in a very real way to the midterm elections to reestablish guardrails in the Congress, which would be helpful for reestablishing guardrails in the courts as well. And politicians love to say that the next election is the most important election of your life. How many times have you heard that? But here we are again. It is going to be very true with these midterm elections.
And so there's still off ramps that we can pursue to avoid heading at top speed toward a very bad destination.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure that they're off ramps at this point. I mean, like I've said, you know, I believe in being realistic. I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture. I think that we have some very dangerous trends at work. The great thing about democracy and the way the founding fathers designed our country is we have the ability for new guardrails to crop up in unexpected places, whether that's the emergence of a non-traditional press, with so many people finding a way to get accurate news from new sorts of sources when some of the traditional media sources fail us. Whether that's, you know, I don't know if y'all know anything about this group of fired federal employees on Reddit, but there are hundreds of federal employees saying, if I get fired, I'm going to run for office. And these are people in government who know how government works, how it should work, how to get stuff done. We could see this really remarkable development. So there are still lots of tricks left in democracy's bag.
Joyce Vance, we're so happy you could join us, and I think people come away more enlightened and invigorated with everything that you've been able to tell us, and some informed judgments and guidance about what it is, the steps that we can take to take our government to where we think it ought to be. Hope you will join us again, and look forward to the next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks all of you for being here.
You can listen to Joyce Vance on her podcast, Sisters-in-Law. You can follow her on Substack and, of course, watch her on MSNBC. Join us on Sunday morning, California time. Aloof Ben talks to me about Israel in crisis, bringing up to date and the many developments in the last few weeks. And, of course, he is the editor of Haaretz. And thank you all for watching, for supporting these vital programs through this very difficult time in our world history and our nation's history. Thanks so much.